So Proverbs chapter 4 is going to be a little bit of a recap. I've already bled into chapter 4 in the previous chapters and already commented on two of the more important verses in it. So Lord willing, this might be a relatively short teaching, and a lot of it's just going to really be a recap, but we'll get to those verses later. Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding. For I give you good doctrine. Do not forsake my law. When I was my father's son, tender and the only one in the sight of my mother. Now here, this is Solomon speaking here. His father was King David, and his mother was Bathsheba. And, I mean, just to think about that is incredible. That this is Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba. Obviously not the first one. The first one died. The Lord took the first one. And, you know, there's a whole kind of odd passage when Solomon's born where it says, you know, they named him Solomon, and then essentially God told him to rename him Jedediah, which, not because he was a country boy, but because, what does Jedediah mean? Beloved of God. Yeah, it's a crazy thing because it says right there in the passage after Solomon was born that God loved him and told them to rename him Jedediah, which means beloved or loved by God. And pretty incredible thing. That was definitely kind of scandalous and revolutionary to them. You know, in the Old Testament, there was a lot of, in that period, there was a lot of that false doctrine going around where like the child bore the sins of the parents and all the rest of that. And but so this is King David and Bathsheba he's talking about there. He says now it's important you catch this in verse 4 that this is Solomon saying, he also taught me, that is King David taught me and said to me. And you're going to notice this is very repetitive. He's essentially saying here that when I was tender, when I was young, when I was your age, King David and my mom Bathsheba sat me down and he taught me and said to me. Now again, if you remember from last chapter or the chapter before, Proverbs placed the responsibility of discipline squarely on the father's shoulders. Well, interestingly enough here, it teaches the responsibility of teaching the children on the father's shoulders too, which is very interesting because in our day and age in Christian circles, in non-Christian circles, parents don't, I don't mean to generalize, but it's generally true that parents almost don't teach their kids anything in non-Christian circles, certainly not morally. And but even in Christian circles, it really tends to be a responsibility that falls on the mother. But here, it's saying that King David taught Solomon, and he's, now, again, I want to reiterate, Solomon's saying to Rehoboam here, most people believe that he's talking to Rehoboam because Rehoboam was the one that was going to succeed him as king. And Rehoboam, just for the record, was a gigantic fool. He was a gigantic moron and a failure of a person. You guys probably know the story that after Solomon died and the kingdom fell to Rehoboam, that the tribes came to him with Jeroboam, and they came and they said, hey, why don't you lessen the taxes that your father Solomon had put on us? And so he's like, let me consult with my advisors. He consults with the older advisors, and they say, yeah, you should lessen the taxes on these people. They'll serve you for the rest of your life. It would be a good thing. And then he consults with the younger advisors, like his friends, and they're like, no, make the taxes worse. And so he, being a fool, made the taxes worse, and it split the kingdom. And the northern 10 tribes, give or take, they left. But the Bible makes it very clear that God was in that. But Rehoboam was a complete unmitigated fool. He made a lot of other failures, moral failures. He didn't really love the Lord or follow the Lord. But Solomon is speaking here to Rehoboam, but he's saying, look, everything that I'm telling you, I was told when I was a kid. And Solomon is kind of, sort of, I don't know if he's making a mistake here or he has a misunderstanding, except that he's doing his job as a parent to teach his kid the way that he should live. But the truth is that Rehoboam is going to turn out to be a moron. And it's almost as if at this point you can already sense that Solomon is aware of that he's like, this kid is an idiot, and all of this teaching I'm giving him is not sinking in. You kind of get the gist of those passages in Ecclesiastes, which Solomon wrote much later, where he talks about it really doesn't matter how much money you make and how big you make your kingdom and your house and all this stuff, because what if your son's a fool and you leave it to him? And well, I think he was being a little more than hypothetical there. I think it was dawning in on him later in his life, because Rehoboam didn't take the kingdom until, if I remember correctly, until he was 40. And so Solomon's writing a lot of Ecclesiastes at the older part of his life. Rehoboam was probably in his late 20s or 30s. Solomon knew he was a fool. And incredible, there are some weird things going on, and it's kind of pertinent here. Do you guys, this should be obvious to you, but Solomon was not David's firstborn, right? Solomon wasn't his firstborn. He wasn't even close to being his firstborn. Solomon, there were many other children that David had, because he had multiple wives that were born before Solomon. Why did he give the kingdom to Solomon? Because David made the choice. Because he was godly. Now here's another interesting thing. How old was Solomon when he prayed that, when he was at Gibeon and the vision came to him about, ask whatever you want? How old was he? How old do you think he was? What's kind of the common age idea?
Like kind of a preteen, like 13 to 15.
Pretty early,
14.
right? Pretty young.
Yeah.
I always kind of was picturing more like 8 or 10. Actually, nobody knows the age, because there are no ages to correlate and kind of subtract and add and figure out how old he was, except to say that when that happened, he was already married. He had already made a treaty with the king of Egypt, and he had already taken the king's daughter of Egypt as wife. By doing the math, they can narrow it down to a window, and I've read ad nauseum stuff about this because it kind of pertains to this. But if you were to do all of that and read the dates and the ages of the people around him, and you know how they can kind of add and subtract, the closest they get to is that Solomon was no less than 20, and he probably wasn't older than 35. And so when Solomon, when he's speaking to the Lord and he says, "I am but a small child," he was using hyperbole. He actually, Solomon was in his 20s, possibly in his early 30s, when that happened. And so David giving the kingdom to Solomon, I personally believe that David gave the kingdom to Solomon because he saw, clearly they already knew that God loved him, because God had spoken to David when Solomon was a baby and said, "I love this kid. I want you to rename him Jedediah." And so there's this thing where David, he had God's seal of approval on him, and David apparently knew that Solomon wasn't a complete and utter moron. And as we're looking at these verses, what David said to Solomon, apparently Solomon had a tender heart towards it. And so David's like, "You should be the next king." All of that was to say this: why didn't Solomon do the same thing? Did he have no godly children? Maybe he had no godly children. I'm sure he had a lot of children. He had 700 wives. That's incredible. Maybe he was kind of like that. I think there's a Saudi, is it the king of Saudi Arabia? He just likes getting married, right? Do you know who I'm talking about? The king of Saudi Arabia, I think he's the current king of Saudi Arabia. He has a ton of wives, and I'm under the impression that he practically sleeps with none of them because he just likes marriage ceremonies. And so he marries women to have elaborate marriage ceremonies. I read this whole write-up. It was in like a reputable magazine, probably like 5 or 6, maybe 10 years ago. And literally the current king of Saudi Arabia at the time was marrying all these women because he has this like obsession with marriage ceremony. And maybe Solomon was the same way, but we do know that he had a ton of children, but he had no godly offspring. He had no choice but to leave the kingdom to Rehoboam, who was a complete moron, and he was 40 when Solomon died, so Solomon knew he was a moron. He, David, also taught me, verse 4, and said to me, "Let your heart retain my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get understanding." This is incredible. This kind of dovetails into 1 Kings 3, the passage where Solomon's in his probably, let's just take the mean there, he's in his late 20s. At Gibeon, he's just sacrificed 1,000 bulls at the tabernacle, which was there at the high place at Gibeon. And then God appears to him that night, and God says, "Ask whatever it is, I'll give you." Like, that's a pretty crazy question. What if God asked you that? Could you be really honest with yourself? Don't answer for me. But if God asked you that right now, what would you say? What would you say? Because I personally, as I think about that, I think the answer should always be something along the lines of, I could ask at this point in my life to be making more money. It wouldn't hurt. It would help my family. I could ask at this point in my life for health, or so that I could provide security for my children or whatever. But what would I ask for if, like, that's an incredible thing that God asked him that. What if I told you that I think God is asking you that? He's almost always sort of asking you that. Not necessarily every single day, but I think as a believer, you as a child of God, I don't really totally think Solomon was unique. I think that God asks every believer that. I think he asks every believer that. And to the believer that pivotal point in their life where they make that choice, where the world is laid out before you, and essentially there is the unspoken but real question: what do you want? What are you going to do with your life? To the person at you guys' stage, really kind of before you guys' stage, this is a better concept for like a high school group, but it's still, I think, pertinent. To the person who says, I really want what God wants. I really want what God wants. To that person, he gives you exceedingly abundantly above what you could have ever asked or thought. I found that to be true in my life, and I apologize, I become a fool in boasting. But when I was that age, when I was 18, by God's grace, I'm not even 100% sure I would make the same decision now. But by God's grace, I was like, God, I want nothing else but your will. I want for your will to be done. And God has done exceedingly abundantly above all I ever could have asked or thought in my life. I really think, though, as I was kind of thinking about this week, this kind of popped into my mind. He is. For a lot of you guys, he is. The world is your oyster, as the world would say, but God would say the same thing. We know without a shadow of a doubt, in James, he says, ask and I'll give you wisdom. I want to give it to you. Ask and I'll give you the Holy Spirit. I want to give you the Holy Spirit. Ask and I will give white fields to you, fields white. But so many of us, so many people, they never really cross the threshold where they stop thinking about themselves. The three things that he could have asked for: the life of his enemies, long life, or riches. They never stop focusing on those things, and so they never enter into the blessing of God. The blessing of God. And I'm not saying that the Christian life is only blessing. I'm not naming it and claiming it. But I would be doing a disservice if I only preached the brokenness of the whole thing, too. As we talked about last week or the week before. That concept where we are blessed and broken. And he truly, I know he truly wants to bless you, and he has to break you. And so there is a period in your lives, and I think that maybe for some of you here tonight, you might even be at that pivotal point in your life where God, if you only knew that he's standing in front of you saying, what do you really want? Make up your mind. Maybe that's an important point for some of you, to make up your mind. Maybe you're wavering between two things, and he says, make up your mind. Me or the other thing. And I'm here to tell you that if you choose him, he'll give you all of the other things at some point, in some way, and he might take them away too, and that's okay, because he's all that really matters. But for some of you, he might be standing there almost literally at the door of your heart saying, ask, what is it you want? What is it you want? But so he asks Solomon that, what do you want? And this is cool, because this is what David said to him, verse 5 there. Get wisdom, get understanding, and it sunk in. To have a son, a child, to have something you teach sink in, and he wanted wisdom. I love that. I love how this ties in with that Solomon's saying here, when I was a son, my father, King David, said, keep my commandments and live, get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will preserve you. Love her, and she will keep you. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. In all you're getting, get understanding. Now, again, this is one of those things, and I know I'm treading a very fine line here. This is one of those concepts that doesn't completely just pass right into the New Testament thinking. There is nowhere in the New Testament where it says that wisdom is the principal thing. And it's not only that it doesn't say that, it doesn't even convey that idea. There's very little even said about the New Testament in wisdom, other than the book of James. Very little is even said about wisdom. Now, Jesus talked about it. Wisdom is justified by all of her children. There were a parable here and there. But in the New Testament thinking, there are things that are much, much, much more important than getting wisdom. There's actually, when you're going through Proverbs and you start thinking, like as I've kind of been pondering, like Proverbs versus the New Testament, I'm all in the Proverbs. When you start like you're in Proverbs, like I'm in Proverbs, you start noticing that there's actually a severe deficiency of wisdom in the New Testament. At least, and I don't mean the New Testament is full of wisdom, but comments about wisdom. There's a severe deficiency of comments about wisdom in the New Testament. I'm certain that the New Testament would not repeat that in this sense that wisdom is the principal thing. I would dare say, if I've been pondering, I don't have my head fully wrapped around it, but I think the New Testament would say, get a relationship with God. A relationship with God is the principal thing, because that's where godly wisdom comes from. Another thing, I'm really broaching the edge of my understanding, and that's probably obvious because I don't have my head fully wrapped around these things. But can I tell you guys that the more I've been kind of considering this and reading the passages like in 1 Corinthians, talking about the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom, that the idea is Jesus being the wisdom, that it's almost never actually truly ours. That the wisdom is only found in Him. And so that in the New Testament, when I say get a relation, with all you're getting, if there's one thing you get a relationship with Jesus, it's because He is wisdom. And so when you get Jesus, you get all of the principal things in Him. You get wisdom because it's in Him. It's not really so much something that ever rises out of you or emanates from you. It's something that is, in my opinion, always in Him, as life is in Him. Life is principally, and He says, I am the life. And so I would say that here. I think it needs to be said. I think that there are people, and again, well-meaning people, maybe parents, who they just straight read Proverbs and quote it to their children, and they teach their children as though this is New Testament thinking and this is New Testament doctrine. And quite frankly, it's really actually not. Half the places in the New Testament are almost negative about wisdom. Knowledge, this idea that knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If there's one thing, I would say, it would say get love. With all you're getting, get love. I think that could be understood. Hey, man. Anyways, not trying to be heretical, but I can't wrap my head around this in the sense that wisdom is the principal thing for our day and age. It's really actually not. Having a relationship with Jesus is the principal thing. Exalt her, and she will promote you. She will bring you honor when you embrace her. She will place on your head an ornament of grace, a crown of glory she will deliver you. So that's kind of end quote. That's where David's conversation, what he said to him is ending, and he's going to go on and he's going to say more what he's actually saying to Rehoboam. So, I'll talk about that in a few verses when I get there. So this is Solomon. Hear, my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have taught you in the way of wisdom, and I have led you in right paths. This here in verse 11, at least in the New King James translation, begins it's the first of four verses where it contrasts a way with a path, but they're really the same thing. It's just a change in the word. But a way is a path, and a path is a way. I have taught you in the way of wisdom, and I have led you in right paths. This is not so much a contrast as a comparison like the other ones are. But obviously the two-part, that he didn't just teach him, he led him. And that's very clear. When you walk, your steps will not be hindered, and when you run, you will not stumble. Take firm hold of instruction. Do not let go. Keep her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they do not sleep unless they have done evil, and their sleep is taken away unless they make someone fall. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. Verse 18, but the path of the just is like the shining sun that shines ever brighter unto the perfect day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. So I like this is one of those verses where I think the NIV translation is actually better. The NIV translation of verse 18 reads, "The path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day." Shining ever brighter till the full light of day. I have four insights here, in personal insights into Proverbs 4:18. Before I get into them, I want to now take in light of Proverbs 4:18. I want to take a look back at what Solomon was saying David said to him. Why did Rehoboam turn out to be such a fool and Solomon didn't? Well, I think that partially, no matter how good or how bad a parent is, your child has a free will, and they're going to become who they're going to become. There are good parents who raise good, godly children, and then they have a child come along, and that child has a free will, and they have their own thing that they somewhere along their choices, the choices they make, the things that they love, their heart gets a certain bent and loves the world and wants nothing to do with godliness. And sometimes that just happens. But I really think there's an interesting thing in light of Proverbs 4:18 that the path of the righteous is like the first light of day, growing ever brighter until the full light of day. This idea that, Solomon was born to King David and Bathsheba, right? King David and Bathsheba. King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, saw her bathing ironically on the rooftop while he was walking on top of his palace. Should have been at war, called for her, brought her, had sex with her, got her pregnant, and then had to kill her husband, probably the most honorable man in the entire world. Had to have him killed because he wouldn't sleep with her to cover it up. That's the worst. It's gonna come. It's gonna come like one I can't stop it. So that's where Solomon didn't come from that union, but Solomon came from that event. But he did come from that union. But here's the interesting thing, and if you're following me, David and Bathsheba, David actually lived quite a while after that event. And a lot of times people tend to stop looking at the life of David after the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. And they fail to realize that most of David's best days were after that event. What a dark period in his life for Solomon's mother and dad to even be together because of lust, adultery, and murder is incredible. If you can put yourself in that position, like you're here because literally your dad committed adultery with your mom and murdered her ex-husband. And that's the union that everybody knows you came from. The darkness that is in that. But here we have this verse that says the path to the righteous is like the first light, is like the light of dawn, essentially growing ever brighter till noon. From that day on, the rest of David's life, if you look at his life and all the different places that it's recorded in Chronicles and Samuel and in Kings, you start to get this concept that David's life from that point on got nothing but brighter. And that from that point on, he had this boy Solomon, and he had the rest of this family, and he took his son and he trained him up in the way that he should have trained him up. And that David and Bathsheba's life, at this point of intense darkness, grew ever brighter. And Solomon saw it happen. On the flip side, though, Solomon had Rehoboam from a woman named Naamah, who was an Ammonite. And you guys are probably aware, if you know anything about Solomon, that Solomon, his big problem is that all these women that he married all these pagan women, and then he got drug into their pagan practices. And so the difference is, if you're tracking with me, the difference between Rehoboam and Solomon is that from Solomon's birth, his parents' lives were getting ever brighter, and from Rehoboam's birth, his parents' lives were getting ever darker. As I was kind of wrapping my head around this, I think that there's really something to that. If you're still following me, you guys should be aware that Solomon, he departed from the Lord, really. I believe he's going to be in heaven, but from the point he started marrying all these women and participating in their pagan practices, the Bible says he loved God in spite of those things. and that he loved God, and in spite of the fact that he got drug into that. And so I have no doubt that Solomon's going to be in heaven. That being said, though, his son grew up in a household with an Ammonite mother, and his father being a compromiser in all sorts of ways. And so even though Solomon here, he's trying to teach him wisdom, and he's saying he led him in the right paths, it's kind of interesting because, quite frankly, from everything Solomon said about himself, we know that he didn't lead him in the right paths. He led him in the paths to his mother's pagan altar. It's pretty incredible, actually. And so I only say that because I think it ties in interestingly, and maybe it's only pertinent to me right now since I have kids, but as you guys grow up and you have kids, and you know, it's going to happen. You're going to get married, you're going to have kids. It's not so much about being perfect, except as much as it is about staying on the right path. I think of people that I've known over the years, and I've known quite a few people over the years who had kids, and I was like, man, these people, they are really screwed up. But something cool happened. I'm thinking of a couple in particular now that the father and the mother actually had a radical conversion. They were going to church their whole lives, but they had a radical conversion when their kids were like 10, like in that area. And like the impact on their kids to see the darkness and then the dawn and like their life getting brighter was actually really quite incredible. And I just say that to say that it's really not so much about being perfect as it is about being on the right path. 4 insights from Proverbs 4:18 that I have just quickly. The first one is actually something we already talked about, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But it says the path of the righteous is like the shining sun that shines ever brighter into the perfect day. It does not say the path of the wise, and I already commented on that a couple weeks ago. I don't want to say much more about it. I'll just reiterate that for you guys. I think that's important because Solomon was the wisest person who ever lived, but he was not the most righteous person who ever lived. And because there was not this rightness in his life, it doesn't matter how wise he was, his path actually grew darker. And so that's a very important distinction. Again, let me reiterate, I think there are much more important principal things than wisdom. Secondly, my second insight that helps me when I look at this verse, I've loved this verse for a very long time, is that it needs to be understood that the path starts out dark. I like J.B. Phillips' commentary on this passage, because in his commentary he likens it actually to the point before daybreak where you first see the light appearing in the sky, in the eastern sky, and then it grows ever brighter until the sun rises, and then it goes up in its arc. And it's a very interesting comparison, the way that he takes the Hebrew and he breaks that down. But the path starts out dark. The path starts out dark. Now, whether you realize it or not, one of the main charges that's leveled against us as believers is that we only believe in God because it's convenient for us to believe in Him, because we were raised Christian. And so I believe, well, Chris, you were raised in a Christian home, so you believe God because it's how you believe in God because it's how you were raised. Or you can take Jesse Ventura, the professional wrestler / governor of Montana's response. Religion is a crutch for the weak-minded. You people only believe in God because you can't face up to the harsh realities of a life without some omnipotent, benevolent being giving you everything you want and there for you when you die. And so the religion and Christianity is just a crutch for the weak-minded. And so that's leveled out against us. And it says essentially the idea is that you believe it because you want to believe it, not because it's true. I'm sorry, that was not my experience. That was not my experience. My Christian life started out very dark. I believed it because it was true. When I gave my life to the Lord when I was like 16 and then later committed my life to Him when I was 18, I did so because it was true. I didn't like the idea of it. It was very, very dark. And for years, it was hard for me to be a Christian. I was a Christian because it was the truth, not because it was the easiest. And the reason I say that is because my life has come to a point now where I love being a Christian and I don't want to be a non-Christian. I have passed that point that Much Afraid came to in Hind's Feet on High Places, where I have gone. I've walked with the shepherd for years and years and years and years, and I have gotten to the edge of the high places, to the place of blessing, and had the path turned down the mountain in what appeared to be a sick, twisted, cruel sort of manipulation from God himself deceiving me. And I stopped there like Much Afraid did in the book, and I looked back and I thought for a moment, for an hour or two, of turning back and not following the shepherd anymore, like Much Afraid does in the book. And I said, you know what? I don't need to keep doing this anymore. I don't need to follow God anymore. And I looked back, probably 1, 2, or 3 times in my life. And there was a point where I said, you know what? I don't want a life without him. It doesn't even matter. He is the truth. He has the words of life, just like Peter said, just like the disciples said, where else would I go? I have nowhere else to go, because he is the only truth I've found in this life. I am so far beyond that. I'm at the point now where I want to believe it. I believe it because it's true, and I love the Lord, and I love the fact that I believe it, and I believe something I want to believe, and my life is full of light, but it hasn't always been that way. You see, I was one of those people that I gave my life to the Lord because as a non-believer, I couldn't believe in evolution. I remember sitting there in my chemistry class in high school and having Mr. Vaughn teach us about carbon dating, and just sitting there going, are you guys for real? Like, this is circular. And now you have to remember, I was not walking with the Lord. I was the farthest thing from a Christian that you could imagine at that point in my life. When we used to ride the school bus around the corner turning onto Mustang Way, and the guy that stands out there now in front of MI was still there then with the Jesus Save signs, and I was throwing out the demon fist and going, yelling, Satan save my soul. You know, that was me. That was me when I was 16 and 17. And I meant it. I meant it. I was the furthest thing from a Christian that you can imagine. Grow up in a Christian home or not, I swung as far as I could the other way. But it was the things that troubled me about I could not. It's not that I couldn't face a reality without God. It's that I could not convince myself that he didn't exist, because I saw too clearly the flaws in evolution and all of the other things. And so I was one of those people that I got saved because it was true. I didn't get saved because I thought it was going to make me feel better. I actually knew well enough that it was going to cost me all of my friendships. It was going to cost me a lot as a believer. And I've known a lot of other Christians that they've counted the cost, and that charge that's leveled against us is frankly a crock. For most Christians' experience, we have believed because it's true, not because I want to believe. And there's something beautiful about the believer that's been through those experiences, and God intentionally allows you to go through the darkness so that you can say, no, I followed in the dark. I followed when it was only true, and that's all I had about it, was that it was true and that he was the only person. Even when he seemed to be deceiving me, which was not true, but it appeared true, even when he seemed to be cruel and unkind and apathetic to my needs, I kept following because it was the truth, and he's all I have. And now I find years and years down the road, you couldn't convince me to turn back. It's not even an issue anymore. No matter how hard things get, it's not even an issue. The idea of turning back, it starts out dark, but man, it gets brighter. It gets brighter. The third insight I glean from this is that it's progressive. This getting brighter thing, it's slow. At least 2 or 3 times a week, I see the sunrise. It's just the way my job works out and my hobby works out. You know, it's ironic that I have a job that I get up long before the sun's out, and then I also have a hobby that requires the same thing. But it seems like 2, 3, 4 times a week I'm up before the sun, and honestly, I actually kind of enjoy it. And so, but I'm like in tune with it, particularly when I used to work down south, and I'd be driving down 95 at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. and I'd see the light, you know, about 45 minutes before sunrise. You know, you'd start to see the graying in the east, and then 20 minutes before sunrise, it's like it's almost bright out, but the sun's not above it. And that's what J.B. Phillips likens this verse to, but it's progressive. It's one of those things that you really don't even notice it's happening. Like, you stop and you go in a McDonald's or a bathroom, and then you come back out 4 minutes later, and you're like, whoa, it got a lot brighter. But you're like, when you're there and you're just doing it, you don't even notice how much brighter it's getting slowly, moment by moment. I was thinking about this, like it's some of you guys, you don't know how far you've come because it's progressive. And some of you, you might even be losing heart because you're looking at yourself and because you haven't had a reprieve. You just, it's so slow, this change that God is making in you as your path is growing brighter, that you can lose heart and be like, God, are you, I'm getting worse. I think things are getting worse. A couple different times in my life, I don't feel like I have time to really elaborate on both, but a couple different times in my life, God has blessed me to have a glimpse of how much He is changing me. And one was after Bible college. I was writing one of my professors about a year after I'd graduated, and I was telling him about some stuff that was going on in my life and how God was working hope in me. And as I wrote the word hope in the letter, like it occurred, I had this flashback to writing a paper for this Bible college professor, and I had been talking about hope, and it was just one of those moments because I had a flashback to like the mindset that I had when I was writing the original paper, and I was writing it now. Like it occurred to me, like the word had so much more meaning to me than it had had a year before, and not just like I knew more about the word, but the word was something that was so much more meaningful to me in a deep way, in a way that was mine. And it was a cool flashback, and it really gave me this glimpse of how much God had been using the trials of the previous year, which it had been, my year after Bible college was one of the most disappointing years of my life, how God had been using those trials and tribulations, as Romans 5 says, to build hope and create hope. The fourth thing, and this one's the one I really want to highlight about this, not spend a super long time on it, but I really want to highlight here, is that there is an interesting connection between hope and purity, between purity and hope. 1 John 3 says this. You can turn there if you want. You don't have to. 1 John 3 says this, verses 1 through 3. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore, the world does not know us, because it did not know Him. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be, but we know that when He is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him like He is. And everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself just as He is pure. Two things about this interesting connection between purity and hope. And the first one is that purity is our hope. And the second is that hope makes us pure. Charles Spurgeon said this about this verse, and also about Proverbs 4:18. The Christian is a man of much present enjoyment. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and being God's sons, we cannot be altogether unhappy. Relationship to the ever-blessed God must bring with it a measure of joy. Happy are you, O Israel, sang Moses. Who is like unto you, O people saved by the Lord? The men who can truly be called the sons of God are a blessed people. Still, the main portion of the believer's inheritance lies in the future. It is not so much what I have as what I shall have that makes me joyful. It does not yet appear what we shall be. To the unbeliever, all that is come is in darkness. All that is to come is in darkness. He may expect to go from the shades of evening to the blackness of a midnight that shall never end. But for the Christian, light is sown. He is now in darkness, the only darkness he shall ever know, and from the twilight of the morning he shall go into the perfect day, a day whose sun shall never set. We have the eyes of hope given to us, and looking across the narrow stream of death and beyond, that place where to carnal eyes hangs the curtain that shuts out the unseen, we, with these far-seeing eyes, behold the glory which is yet to be revealed, and we are blessed with the joys of hope. Let every Christian, therefore, when at any time he is downcast about the things of the present, refresh his soul with the thoughts of the future. And then he moves on. Let us look at the believer's hope. The text speaks of men that have hope in Him, which I understand to mean hope in Jesus Christ. The Christian has a hope peculiar to himself. As for its objective, it is the hope of being like Jesus Christ. We shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. Now, some would put it in that shape. They would say that their hope would not put it in that shape. They would say that their hope as Christians is to pass within the pearly gates, to tread the golden streets, to listen to the harpers harping with their harps, and standing upon the sea of glass, to be forever free from sorrow, toil, and pain. But those are only the lower joys of heaven, except so far as they indicate spiritual bliss. I believe that there are some professing Christians who would like Muhammad's heaven. and be perfectly satisfied if they could sit forever on a green and flowery mountain and could drink from the rivers of milk and eat from hives of honey, and so on and so on. But after all, the real truth of God, the truth that is contained in these metaphors and figures and underlies them all, the truth is that the heaven a true Christian seeks after is a spiritual one. It is the heaven of being like his Lord. I take it that while it will consist in our sharing in the Redeemer's power, the Redeemer's joy, and the Redeemer's honor, yet from the connection of the text, it lies mainly in our being spiritually and morally like he, being purified even as he is pure. I must frankly confess that of all my expectations of heaven, I will cheerfully renounce 10,000 things if I can but know that I shall have perfect holiness. For if I may become like Jesus Christ, as to his character, pure and perfect, I cannot understand how any other joy can be denied me. If we shall have that, surely we shall have everything. This, then, is our hope, that we shall be like he, for we shall see him as he is. Purity is our hope. But hope, see you, dude. But hope makes us pure. There's another interesting connection between hope and purity. When I was a youngin', when I was 12 or 13, and I made some terrible decisions, as most of you know my testimony, that I made decisions when I was 12 and 13 that because I wasn't honoring God and I didn't want to honor God, that I was like, I'm not living for him. And so my destination's hell anyways. So if I'm going to go to hell, I'm going to go to hell in style. I'm like, and so like as a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, I made this a really terrifying conscious decision where I was like, I am going to live for myself, and I'm going to live to have as much pleasure as possible and do whatever I want. That's why I stopped going to school, trying to sleep around with the girls in youth group and all the rest of that stuff. Years later, as a Christian, I was thinking back to that period, and I was like, why did I make those decisions? Why did I make that decision? And I really narrowed it largely down to one thing. There were other elements in the reason, but I narrowed it down to one thing in my understanding, and it was a lack of hope. For me, I grew up extremely, extremely poor, in a way that I'm not certain that anybody in this room even has any idea what it's like to be that poor. We were incredibly poor, and life was very hard. And for me, it was very difficult. And so by the time I was 11 or 12, life was kind of a drag. I hated school. I was in junior high, which was, so it was 12 or 13. It was terrible. I hated it. I was depressed. We were super poor, but my mom had fought to get us into a good school, so we were in like the rich school, which was kind of worse on me because, a lot of those kids were really cruel, particularly because we had to buy my shoes at Payless and my clothes at Kmart and all that stuff, so it was like hell on earth. And so life was really hard, and I'm not having a pity party, except to tell you this, that I realized that one of the big reasons I made that decision, the decisions that I made I'm just going to live for the moment, is because I had no hope. And let me tie this in a little bit more. When we as Christians talk to non-believers, and we say, hey, and I'm not saying you guys would go do this, but say you go up to a non-believer in the Publix line, and you're like, hey, you shouldn't sleep around. If you sleep around, you might get an STD, or you might get your girlfriend pregnant or whatever. The disconnect is not that they disagree with us. It's not that they disagree. As a 12-year-old, it's not that I would have disagreed with that. I would have been like, yeah, you're right. If I go smoke pot and sleep with that girl, and do whatever, there are going to be consequences. But you know what my problem was? Is that my life already sucked. It already was one minute-by-minute story of life sucking. And I was like, who cares if it sucks later? It sucks now. I can have some pleasure for an hour, some pleasure for a few days, some pleasure for a few months. I'll probably kill myself later anyways. Who cares? I'll self-destruct later on. And what I'm getting at is, do you see the connection between hope and purity? When a person does not have hope, see, it's the disconnect that Christians have, oftentimes the church has, when it talks to non-believers. is that we tell them things that are true, generally true, and they're not dumb. They acknowledge them, but they don't care. You never think about how stupid that one Katy Perry song is where she's talking about, Friday night we got drunk and I maxed out my credit card and all that stuff and, all of the different things that I can't even say that she says in that song. And you look at that, you're like, dude, she is readily acknowledging the stupidity of her lifestyle. And at the end of the song, she's like, next Friday night we're going to do the same thing. And you're like, dude, you are self-destructing. And she would say, you're right, I am. But there's a lack of hope. The disconnect, the reason that one of the big reasons the church disconnects when we talk to the world is that we don't understand the role that hope plays in the whole scheme of things. Can I tell you guys, as I was pondering this, I think, in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about faith, hope, and love, right? And the greatest of these is love. But can I tell you that love gets 80% of the conversation? Faith gets 19% of the conversation. and hope gets 1% of the conversation in Christianity. And I get it, love is the principal thing. I really believe that. But interestingly enough, Christians, we focus a lot on faith and very little on hope. Very little on hope, and I think that that's a mistake. I want to encourage you guys. I feel honestly I feel that some of you have lost hope. Possibly, maybe someone in here has lost hope. Maybe things have gotten so dark, and it's hard for me to believe that this is anybody's situation, or maybe this recording is for somebody someday down the road, so I don't know. But some of you have lost hope, maybe, possibly. It's possible as a Christian to lose hope that God is going to continue to lighten your path. Maybe surprisingly enough, you're still in the very dark portion before sunrise, and you're like, are things ever going to get brighter? Are they ever going to get better? Because it's just hard, and it's been hard for a really long time, and I'm sick of it. And possibly some of you, one of you, maybe none of you, are being tempted. And hopefully this teaching, if it does nothing else, it just shows you the 1-2 punch. The devil brings in the first punch. Oh, your life's hopeless. It's not going anywhere. And then he brings in the temptation. It's always a 1-2 punch with temptation. It's not always only hope, this destroying of hope, but it is a lot of times his jab is, with his left, if he's righty, I don't know. The jab is always a jab at your hope, and then he comes in with the power punch with a temptation. And I want to tell you guys that some of you need to take heart. Possibly, you need to take heart, and you need to take hope. You need to make a decision to stand your ground and to hope, and to trust that God's word is true, because he makes this promise, and it's in the New Testament too. It's throughout the scriptures, that what you have committed to him, he is able to keep. But this promise here, this is a very unique promise. It's an incredible promise that the path of the righteous grows ever brighter. I'll tell you, it's slow. It's imperceptible at first. Before sunrise, you don't even realize it. The sky was black, and then all of a sudden it's just lightly gray, especially in the east. And you can miss that, and you can say, dude, it's just dark, and I'm tired of it, and I don't want to do this anymore. Please take the words of an old fool that it's worth hanging in there. It's worth hanging in there. It's worth resisting the temptation. You have no idea what God has in store for you. God has incredible things in store for you guys. I'm not necessarily saying he has a mansion. He might. I'm not necessarily saying things like that. But I am saying that he has things in store for you that make your life substantial, more than worth living. He promises to do exceedingly abundantly above all you ask or think, but he's testing you now. He's testing you now because he's looking for something beautiful. It's the thing that is in every great movie love story. The hero, the husband, not the husband, but the man has to be, hopefully he'll become the husband. He has to be tested. That's why we watch a love story. Because the pursuer, and in some cases, it might be a woman could be tested. But the point is that it's the thing that makes it worth watching, is that this person has withstood temptation. What is the ranger's name in Lord of the Rings that I always get wrong? Aragorn. Thank you, because I was going to say it wrong. Aragorn. That's why I asked.
There's so many errors.
I know. Have you guys ever noticed, though, like about halfway through the second movie, though, I was like, why doesn't he just kiss the blonde girl? The princess from the Horse Kingdom or whatever. I'm just like, well, I didn't read the books, but my point is I'm just like, this is dragging out, and he's never going to see Liv Tyler again. He just needs to fall in love with a curly-haired blonde girl. But you guys understand the beauty of the story is that he had an option. Because did they intone that right, that she kind of was pursuing him for a period?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And the whole point of the story is that he resisted. And he stayed true to his one true love that was distant. And my point, I'm just saying this because the test that God is putting you through, he's doing something beautiful in your life, that you're going to stand before him as a trophy of his grace one day in heaven, and he's going to say, this person loved me even when everything was dark and nothing was going right, and they had every option to turn and walk away. This person didn't turn and walk away. This person didn't leave. The path of the just is like the shining sun that shines ever brighter into the perfect day. But the way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. Take heart tonight. Those of you maybe who have lost hope, take heart. My son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to all their flesh. I'm just going to read through the end and then make some comments on verse 23. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. We'll come back and comment on that for just a moment. Put away from you a deceitful mouth and put perverse lips far from you. Let your eyes look straight ahead and your eyelids look right before you. In this verse I've also already bled into from previous chapters, but ponder the path of your feet and let all your ways be established. Ponder the path of your feet. We already talked about this in one of the earlier chapters. This whole section of Proverbs, he keeps talking about paths. And you guys, I believe you were all here when we were talking about that. But the interesting thing about a path, the reason he's saying ponder the paths of your feet is because you're all on a pathway. Whether we realize it or not, we're on a pathway. And pathways have they have set courses, they have set destinations, and oftentimes you can't see the destination from where you are on the course. And so it's worth stopping at some point in your life and pondering and saying, is this pathway that I'm on leading me to a good destination? Is the course I should be on? This is from 2012. A marriage proposal in southern Indiana concluded with a shock late Wednesday when the hot air balloon carrying the future bride and groom hit a power line and knocked the pilot unconscious, a sheriff's office spokesman said. The airborne proposal was heading for a happy ending as the balloon began to land at about 8 p.m. in Sellersburg, Indiana, just north of Louisville, Kentucky. When the basket touched the ground, the female said yes to the engagement, and Major Chuck Adams with the Clark County, Indiana Sheriff's Office. But they had landed on a patch overgrown with tall grass, so the pilot and balloon owner, Dallas Beal, who owns a jewelry store, boosted the balloon and tried to land again, and that's when it hit the wires, Adams said. The basket holding the passengers made contact with the power lines. An electric shock knocked out Beal, who fell into the bride-to-be, giving her an electric jolt as well. The future groom gave Beal CPR, possibly reviving him. The pilot was conscious when my officers arrived on scene, Adams said. It pays to ponder the path of your feet, because I guarantee you when that groom woke up that morning, he thought he was going to be giving mouth-to-mouth to his fiancée, not to some random dude. You got to be careful. I don't know if a hot air balloon is a really great place to make a proposal, but it's worth pondering the path of your feet. Is this going to lead me to be kissing some dude? I mean, because I want to be. I think he. Oh, that's good. Well, this was 2012, so I think he wasn't given mouth to mouth to who he thought he was going to be given mouth to mouth to. Honestly, though, it pays It pays to ponder the path of your feet. So often, your generation, I'm not saying this is you guys, your generation never gives a second thought to the future. They never give a second thought to the direction that pathways lead, and you need to be careful about that. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Remove your foot from evil. And now I just want to finish here with just really essentially one or two comments about verse 23. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Interesting verse, right? Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Why does it say this? Well, I don't have all night to kind of break down why I believe this. You can kind of take my word for it and look it up yourself and study it yourself. But I have become firmly convinced that what this verse is talking about is be careful what you believe. You can't always be careful about what enters your eyes. You can't always control what's going to enter your ears, what you're going to see, what you're going to hear. And to be really quite honest, I'm not even entirely certain it matters. I really believe Jesus, when he said it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out. I believe that metaphorically he was really talking about the things that we see and hear, not just about the things that we eat. Why am I saying this? The reason I'm saying it is that it goes a little deeper than simply what you see and what you hear. And if you're following me, you understand that most people, when they've taken this verse, they've traditionally taught it with the idea of don't go to rated R movies, don't listen to secular music or this type of music, don't do this, don't... And I get that, and I'm not saying that it doesn't in any way say that, but what I am saying is what I really believe it's talking about when it's talking about keeping your heart is that something that's far more pertinent is be careful what you believe. Be careful what you believe. Because just because I went say I went and saw a movie that had a cuss word in it does not necessarily mean that I'm going to start cussing this week, okay? It's really not how it works. There's something deeper that goes on. And it's all of that was to say this. Be careful what you believe. I want to give you an example. About 2 years ago, I heard a teaching, and I believe it was like at a pastor's conference, a Calvary pastor's conference, and it was a teacher that I respected, and he said one line that stuck out to me, and I grabbed it, and I believed it when he said it. And he said, I think we give the devil too much credit. I think we give the devil too much credit, and we end up blaming him for a lot of things that are our fault. You know, we just blame everything on the devil. And I grabbed that, and I'm like, I think he's right. I think I blame too much on like the devil's spiritual warfare and stuff. And so I believed it when I heard it. And can I tell you that for about 9 months, that belief wreaked havoc in my spiritual life. And I didn't realize it until 9 months later. My spiritual life was in shambles. And I'm like, why? I'm like seeking the Lord. I'm like, why am I like so torn up inside? And it was the Holy Spirit gave me clarity to when I had gone back and I believed this. And what happened is then moving forward from that belief caused the way I thought and the way I acted. And I started, when things would come in, I would blame myself. And it gets really twisted when you start blaming yourself for fiery darts that are fired from the enemy, because things get really warped really fast. And you have now given him a position of impunity where he can shoot you all the time, and you blame yourself. And you turn into this like completely easy, pathetic target. And I had done that. And so when I became aware of it, that I had adopted this false, this thing that was this non-truth, and that it had wreaked havoc in my spiritual life, I had to deal with it, and I had to get rid of it. And all of a sudden, things started to cohere again. And all of that is to say this. I have become convinced that the reason you have to be very careful about what you believe is because the things that you believe, you are literally taking that thing that you believe and you're inserting it as code into who you are, into your heart. And in the same way that you go up to a computer and you start interfacing with that computer, there is code below the layers. You know, there's layers, there are windows, and there's layering in a computer and an operating system. And underneath all the layering, there's code, which is telling the computer how to respond to your inputs. It really doesn't do anything. It hasn't been already programmed to do. And the reason I'm saying this is because we as Christians can find ourselves acting in ways where we're like, dude, why? Whoa, how did I come to the place where I'm doing this? I'm doing this thing that I hate, and I don't know how to stop myself. Can I tell you that possibly it's because you adopted a wrong belief at some point 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, 6 years ago? You adopted a belief. You believed something that maybe possibly was not true, and when you did, you inserted it as code into your heart, and now it's causing you to live and to think and to act in a certain way, and you go, dude, how did I get here? And how do I get out? I'm trying everything I can. I'm fasting. I'm praying. I'm reading the Bible all the time, and I can't seem to get free of this thought process or this action in my life. Quite possibly, it's a wrong belief. It's a non-truth that you have believed, and when you believed it, you inserted it as code into your heart, and now it's wreaking havoc. That is, I honestly believe that is what this verse means, the heart of what it means when it says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. See how that concept dovetails into James, where James is like, you say you believe this, but you act this way. He's essentially saying your actions will tell you what you really believe. And the church, the world, is full of people who say they believe one thing and they act a different way. And if there's one thing that I can just say from James right now, it's that he's saying, you want to know what you believe? Look at your actions. Because a lot of people, he says earlier in the book, if you're a hearer of the word and not a doer, if you're a hearer only and not a doer of the word, you're deceiving yourself. And he says, here, there's a really easy way to tell, though, if you're deceiving yourself. If you've deceived yourself, look at your actions. If your actions are this way, it has to do with what you believe. That's what he's saying in James chapter 2 and chapter 3. He's saying, your belief, what you believe, will cause what you do. Father, I thank you for your word. I pray for every single one of us that you would help us, Lord, to keep our hearts with all diligence, for out of it flows the issues of life. I pray for every single one of us, if there is an area where we have adopted a non-truth and we've believed a lie, that you would reveal that to us. I'm convinced that every single one of us has at least small lies that we've believed that have affected who we've become and the ways that we think and what we do. I pray, Lord, that you would remove any deception in our lives, Lord, and that you would maybe give us time to ponder the paths of our feet and to meditate on these things, and that you would give us clarity by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.